about ready to get started. I'm Harrison Hopkins. I'm the president and founder of Secular Student Alliance at Presbyterian College, which is putting on this event. First off, I want to thank you all for coming out here. I see a lot of people who aren't from PC, which is really awesome. So thank you all for making the drive out here. A little bit about Secular Student Alliance at PC. I formed the group fall semester of my freshman year, which was a year and a half ago now, to provide a community for the non-religious students on PC's campus. As I found out after I came here, a few years before, there was an underground group for the non-religious that basically they couldn't get recognition because they were afraid of blowback from other students and the faculty. But as I found out when I started talking to faculty and students, no one actually cared. So we got started right away. I worked with Linda Jameson even before I got on campus with starting a group. And I see a lot of people in here who are on the first sheet that we had to turn in to get approval to form a group. So with that little background, you're all here tonight because we are bringing our first big name speaker, Greta Christina. As you all, well, as most of you know, maybe not actually, Greta Christina is a fairly well-known atheist blogger, and that's an understatement, really. She's one of the top 10, I think is what the ranking puts you at, one of the top 10 atheist bloggers in America, at least, if not the world. She's been blogging since it was either late 80s or early 90s, 89, wasn't it?
I've been blogging since 2005, but I've been writing since 1989.
Writing since 89, okay. And a variety of issues, LGBTQ issues, feminism issues, and most recently getting big into secularism issues. Tonight her talk is on religion and sexuality, which is a talk that or atheism and sexuality, which is a talk that she's been working on since as it kind of blurs and blends together, as I said, many of her previous sessions. As you all know, last year, the Foundation Beyond Belief was working with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society with their Life Now campaign. And the Foundation Beyond Belief's honored hero was Christopher Hitchens, who had passed away that year, or the year before, from esophageal cancer. I can't say that. As it was just recently announced, the Foundation Beyond Belief is continuing their partnership with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and Greta is this year's honored hero for Foundation Beyond Belief, as last year she battled cervical cancer and has obviously come out on top. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn you all over to who you came here for, and Greta.
Well, thank you very much, Harrison, for that very kind introduction. This is well. Thank you all so much for coming out here. Thanks to the Secular Student Alliance of Presbyterian College and all its officers. Big shout out to the Secular Student Alliance. If you're not familiar with them, they're an umbrella organization, national and international organization of secular groups like this all around the country and all around the world, and they're a big part of what makes these kinds of speaking events and, in fact, secular student organization possible. And I just mostly want to thank all of you for coming out today. So I'm here today to talk about, by the way, I'm not light, so I just want to check. Can everybody hear me in the back? Okay, we're good. So I'm here today to talk about atheism and sexuality. Unsurprisingly, to anyone who understands how evolution works, sexuality has an important, hugely important place in human experience. And religion has gotten to control the conversation about sexuality, much like it's gotten to control the conversation about pretty much everything for hundreds and indeed thousands of years. And if atheists are going to be working towards a world in which atheism is both more accepted and more common, we need to offer some secular ways of dealing with sex. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about some of the ways that we can be sexual without a religious framework. And I'm going to break it up into two categories. I'm first going to talk about how atheists can view sexual morality without a belief in God. And then I'm going to talk about how we can view sexual transcendence without a belief in the supernatural. But before I talk about atheism and sexuality, I want to talk a little bit about religion and sexuality. Because I want to talk about what exactly it is that atheists feel like we're up against and what exactly it is that we feel that we need to offer an alternative to. Okay, so the first religious view that I'm going to talk about today, and it's what I'm going to spend the most time talking about, it's the view of most traditional religions, certainly not all of them, and there's exceptions, and I'll be getting into that in a bit, but it is by far the most common religious view of sexuality. And that view is God cares who you have sex with and how. God only wants you to have sex with certain people, most typically a person of the opposite sex to whom you're legally married, although not always. You know, for instance, there are some religions who permit and support same-sex marriage, and there are other religions that ban sex entirely. Not surprisingly, those religions don't stick around very long. Here's an important tip: if you want your religion to last more than a generation, don't make procreation a sin. And God only wants you to have certain kinds of sex with these people. I mean, even within sanctioned marriage, religious restrictions against the kinds of sex you can have include restrictions against oral sex, anal sex, sex using birth control, ejaculation outside the vagina, sex with a woman who's menstruating, the use of pornography and erotica, cross-dressing, even some non-sexual activities such as dancing are prohibited by some religions because it could potentially become sexual or lead to sex. Now, if these restrictions, if these religious restrictions on sexuality were based on fundamental human ethics, or even on practical considerations, you'd expect them to be at least somewhat similar across every religion. And that's really not what we find. And there's a few common themes, you know, for instance, sex is likely to result in procreation with an opposite-sex partner you're legally married to. That's usually on God's yes list. But throughout history and across different cultures, when we look at religious taboos on sex, we see a ridiculously wide range. For instance, some religions are perfectly okay with the standard variations, such as oral or anal sex, you know, as long as it stays within marriage. Other religions believe that God frowns on any sort of sex, other than what sex educators refer to as PIV, or penis and vagina intercourse. Still others say that certain variations are okay, but they have very strict prohibitions on others. There's some religions that say, for instance, well, oral sex, of course, that's fine. Why would God care if you have oral sex? But anal sex, are you kidding? God hates that. Or the other way around. And of course, very famously, different religions have different beliefs about how these rules should be applied to women versus men. I mean, the sexual double standard is depressingly common across a lot of religions, but the details of how this double standard can apply vary tremendously across different religions. Is the punishment for adultery the same for women and men? Are the rules about interfaith marriage the same for women and men? Are the rules for divorce the same for women and men? Or is it easier for instance, men to get divorced than it is for women? Is monogamy required for both women and men, or are men, you know, allowed and indeed encouraged to have multiple spouses? Different religions answer all these questions very differently. And even the question of who it's okay to marry, who it's okay to have this permissible marital sex with, varies tremendously from religion to religion. Different religions have different rules about how old you can be to get married, how closely you can be related, whether it's okay to have been married before, or whether marriage is just a one-time deal throughout your whole life, even how many people you can marry. And what's more, and I think very importantly, some religious restrictions on sex only address sexual behavior. They only restrict what you're actually doing sexually with your bodies. While other religions don't just cover forbidden sexual behavior, they cover forbidden sexual thoughts and desires. And in case you're thinking, oh, this is just like some sort of, you know, weirdo fringe theology, no, that is a teaching of Jesus in the Gospels. Consider the teaching that of actually who I've lately taken to calling because I'm not entirely convinced that the historical Jesus existed, so I've taken to calling him the Jesus character in the New Testament myth. Consider the teaching in the Gospels that lusting in your heart is every bit as sinful as committing adultery. When I think about this teaching, I basically see it as a thought crime. I really can't find any way to see it other than a thought crime. It's punishing you for thinking. And this kind of religious thought crime has a very ugly effect. It has the effect of making people feel guilty and dirty for something that they can't help. For sexual desires that have been deeply and indisputably hardwired into our unconscious by millions of years of evolution. Has anybody here read the writings of the Christmas underwear bomber? First of all, do people remember the Christmas underwear bomber? This was a few years ago. This was an extremist Islamist terrorist who tried to blow up an airplane by strapping explosives into his underwear. It's really worth reading his writings. He kept diaries before he committed this act, and it's this kind of fascinating window into a certain kind of religious extremism, but also in particular into a certain kind of religious guilt about sex. This man was tortured with religious guilt over sexual feelings that he believed were sinful. And he also had a certain amount of guilt over some sexual acts as well that were forbidden by his religion, such as the horribly unthinkable act of not lowering his gaze in the presence of women. But he was also just tortured by simple sexual desire. And we're not talking about desires that were in any way unethical. We're not even talking about desires that were particularly unusual. You know, this guy was not into bondage, this guy was not into jello, this guy was not into humping women on the subway. As far as we know, this guy was not even gay. The mere fact that as a man, he found women sexually attractive, the mere fact that as a man, he was aroused in the presence of women, this was enough to torment him with terrible guilt and terrible fear that he was disappointing his God and was going to be punished for it. And when you think about it, this kind of religious thought crime, this shaming and punishing of people for sexual desire, it's like making people feel guilty about getting hungry. It's like making people feel guilty about needing to sleep. And this is not a necessary inherent part of religious sexual morality. This is not something all religions do. Only a handful of the really special ones. And very often, the sexual ethics of a religion aren't just inconsistent with the ethics of other religions. They're inconsistent with themselves. They are internally inconsistent. And my favorite example, and by favorite I mean it makes me really, really mad, although it's also kind of comical, take the moral lesson conveyed by so many conservative Christian teachings. Sex is dirty and bad, and you should save it for the person you love. Sex is so dangerous that even talking about it can send the desire spinning wildly out of control. It is wicked, it is disgusting. You should not even think about it until your wedding night. Which, if your good little boys and girls will come onto your cherry, will suddenly, magically be a glorious pinnacle of sacred joy and delight. Okay, so now this teaching doesn't just conflict with the teachings of different religions. It doesn't even just conflict with some really basic realities of human sexuality, such as the reality that, hey, you know what, first times often aren't that great. It conflicts with itself. It is internally inconsistent. So clearly, when we look at religious rules about sexuality across different religions, we're not looking at a straightforward and unambiguous message from God. And we're not even looking at a solid set of fairly well thought out moral positions based on sound, consistent ethical principles. What we're looking at is an almost random set of taboos. And they're taboos that really make no more sense than the taboos we have about food or drugs. And even if the taboos originally, hundreds or thousands of years ago had some sort of practical or ethical core behind it, that has long been lost since it became enshrined as a taboo. Now there's many anthropologists, one who I remember from when I was in college is Mary Douglas, have argued that the point of taboos is to give people the feeling of control over very important and powerful aspects of our lives that feel out of control, such as food and drugs and sex. And that the human need for taboos, psychologically speaking, is more important than the specifics of what those taboos are, or whether or not they're rational or practical. That we have this psychological need to make taboos about important areas of our lives, and that's why we have them, not because they actually make sense. And that's what religious restrictions on sexuality look like. they're really only peripherally about ethical matters, such as who's harmed or what's fair. And they're really only peripherally about practical matters, like, ensuring reproduction and maintaining the purity of the genetic line. They're about making people feel like they have control over sex by creating a largely arbitrary line between good sex and bad sex, and convincing themselves that this line was drawn by God. Okay, now granted, there are some more progressive and moderate versions of these traditional religions, Reform Judaism, progressive Christianity, etc., who don't hold with this taboo-based religious view of sex. They believe that God doesn't actually care all that much about the details of what you're doing in bed and with whom, as long as what you're doing is, affectionate and consensual and makes everybody happy. These aren't the most common versions of these religions, but they're hardly unheard of. I'm sure you're familiar with them here at Presbyterian College. And for these more progressive believers, in a day-to-day practical sense, their sexual ethics are a lot more like those of atheists and other non-believers. They're really not based on what's going to make God happy or unhappy. They're based on what makes people happy or unhappy. But even these more progressive Christians, Jews, Muslims, and so on still believe that morality comes from God. The belief that we have a moral compass instilled in us, that we're free to, make choices based on, but they believe that that moral compass was instilled in us by God. They believe that what's important about making people happy or unhappy is ultimately that it makes God happy, that God is happy when we make our friends and partners and family happy. And obviously atheists don't believe that, and we're not going to base our sexual morality on it. So what is the atheist alternative to all of this? If we don't believe that God is peeking into our bedroom and taking notes, if we don't even think there is a God, much less one who cares who we're having sex with and how, what do we base our sexual morality on? Without God, are we just looking at a sybaritic sexual free-for-all, totally uninhibited and totally free of any kind of ethical restraints? I'm sure there's people out there who say, please say yes, please say yes, please say yes. I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. I think the answer is no. And all joking aside, I think it's clear that we want the answer to be no. We don't want a sexual world without ethics. We don't want a sexual world where we don't care who's hurt. Without belief in God, of course we still have sexual ethics. But without belief in God, we're free to base our sexual ethics on, wait for it, ethics. Without belief in God, we don't have to base our sexual ethics on what somebody else wrote down thousands of years ago about what God supposedly told them about how he does and doesn't want us to have sex. We don't have to base our sexual ethics on this external checklist that supposedly God wrote down for us. Human beings seem to have some core ethical values hardwired into our brains from millions of years of evolution as a social species. This is a somewhat controversial view, but it's getting less and less controversial all the time. There's a tremendous amount of support for it from many fields of research, psychology and sociology and neurology and history, and there's lots of fields of research that are supporting this view. We seem to have, as a social species, some core ethical values. Ethics are arguably it's our evolutionary niche. And other animals other than human beings have ethics and have altruism. If you Google animal ethics and animal altruism, you find that most other social animals have some kind of ethics. And then, so we have these core ethical values that we've evolved as a social species, and then we hammer out the specifics and the finer points of these core values, based on what our society teaches us and our particular standards of the world that we're brought up in, and also on our own experience and our own observation of what hurts people and what helps people, what's fair and unfair, and what keeps society running along more or less smoothly. And that's what we can base our sexual ethics on. We don't have to look at God's checklist. We don't have to worry about questions like, does God think anal sex is gross? Instead, we can focus on questions like consent, honesty, fairness, harm. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples. Let's start with a no-brainer, or what I profoundly hope is a no-brainer. Let's look at the question, is homosexuality moral? And instead of answering that question by saying homosexuality is immoral because gay sex makes baby Jesus cry, instead we can ask, is anyone harmed by homosexuality? Is homosexuality consensual? Do homosexual relationships injure society in any way? Is it fair or just to have different rules for same-sex relationships than we do for opposite-sex ones? So let's take another example, one with somewhat less obvious answers, because I really think the answers to all those questions are really obvious. Let's look at a somewhat less obvious question. Let's look at a question like, is pornography moral? And again, instead of looking at God's checklist and seeing whether or not porn is on it, we can ask questions like, is there any good evidence that pornography affects people's sexual behavior in a negative way? Or is the effect of pornography on the people who use it positive? Or is the effect of pornography on the people who use it more neutral or more mixed and ambiguous? We can ask questions like, is there any good evidence that pornography contributes to sexism and misogyny? Any more than any other aspect of popular culture, like TV or movies or video games. We can ask questions like, can we acknowledge the right to freedom of sexual expression while still critiquing the particular ways that porn often plays out in our culture? We can ask, say, can we separate out sort of the larger issue of the basic idea of pornography with the specifics of what porn is actually like on a daily basis in the world around us? And one more example before I move on. We can look at a question like, what kinds of sexual limits should there be within a marriage or a relationship? And instead of saying, well, God thinks oral sex is gross or whatever, instead of looking at God's checklist and saying, okay, well, what's on the yes list and what's on the no list, we can ask questions like, is this activity consensual? Do both partners want to engage in it, or all partners, depending on the kind of activity you're talking about? We can ask questions like, is this sex act relatively safe, or is it likely to cause harm? And if this particular sex act is somewhat more risky than usual, are the people who are engaging in it capable psychologically and emotionally of consenting to this greater degree of risk? We can ask questions like, is everybody involved being honest about their desires and about their limits and about the possible consequences of this particular act or arrangement? We can ask questions like, if partners disagree about a particular sexual act, how do they resolve those differences? Okay, so when we're asking these questions and answering them, I think there's a couple of basic principles that atheists can base our moral decisions on. One is that we have to allow our sexual morality to be nuanced. When we let go of religious taboos on particular sexual acts or arrangements, when we let go of God's checklist, we have to start viewing sexual ethics more on a case-by-case basis. I mean, certainly there are some sexual acts that can clearly be defined as ethical or unethical by, pretty much anybody who's not a sociopath. Rape or child molestation being the most obvious examples. There's a lot of sexual acts and arrangements that fall into a more gray area, where different ethical values come into conflict. And as anybody who studied philosophy will tell you, who studied ethics will tell you, it's where different values come into conflict, where different of those core ethics come into conflict. That's when ethics start to get really interesting and complicated. So here's an example of this. Let's look at a monogamous marriage, where the marriage where both spouses, both partners have agreed in the beginning of the relationship, in the beginning of the marriage, to be monogamous. And one spouse has decided that they don't want to have sex anymore. At all, ever again. Not temporarily because they're sick or they just had a baby or they're depressed or whatever. They are done with sex for the rest of their life. That person isn't willing to negotiate, they're not willing to go to couples counseling, and they're not willing to consider non-monogamy. As far as they're concerned, the fact that they are done with sex for the rest of their life means that their partner's done with sex for the rest of their life too. And in case you're thinking, oh yeah, this is just one of these, philosophical, hypotheticals that philosophy teachers, drum up to torture you and make you think. Unfortunately, it's not. This is not hypothetical. If you read the sex advice columns, you'll find that it is depressingly common. And in case you're thinking that this is a gendered situation, it's really not. This type of situation happens in same-sex relationships between gay men, between lesbians. It happens with people who don't identify in the gender binary. And in opposite-sex relationships, it's not, there's this myth that, oh, it's always the woman who's saying, no, I don't want to have sex anymore. That's not the case. It is very often The man who's saying, yeah, I'm done with sex, you know, I'm too old for that, that's for kids, I'm done. And it's the woman who's saying, hey, I did not sign on to that when we got into this relationship. Okay, so we have two conflicting moral values here. Do people have the right to say no to sex? Well, absolutely. People have the right to say no to sex. That's about as close to a sexual moral absolute as we can come up with. You know, we own our bodies. Actually, I gave this talk once and somebody pointed out, you know what, actually, if you're an atheist and you're a materialist and you don't believe in the soul, you don't think you own your body, you think you are your body. So we are our bodies, and we have really basic right of autonomy over our bodies. We have the right to say no to any particular kind of sex or to all sex, temporarily or permanently at any time, including, you know what, in the middle of having sex. But do people have the right to non-consensually eradicate other people's sex lives? I don't think so. And I'm almost as passionate about that stance as I am about the other one, and for very much the same reason. We own our bodies, we have the right to sexual autonomy. Other people don't have the right to eradicate our sex play forever. Now, you might argue that the other partner, the deprived partner, always has the, you know, they can always leave the marriage or relationship if they're not happy with it. But what if that's an ethically complicated choice? You know, what if the couple has children together? What if they have a business together and breaking up would affect people other than them? Or what if one's partner is financially dependent on the other for health care or other reasons? Okay, so my point in raising this ethical conundrum is not to settle it today. I do have my own opinions about it, but I actually think this is a very thorny question. In fact, that's my primary opinion about it. This is a very thorny ethical question, and that's exactly my point in raising it. You know, my point is that when we move away from strict religious taboos and rules about specific sexual acts and arrangements, when we move away from God's checklist, you know, rules like adultery is always wrong, or people are always obligated to have sex with their spouses, you know, both of which are rules that exist in real religions. When we step away from that, we have to accept that there's going to be sexual situations that raise complicated ethical questions. You know, questions that aren't easy to answer, and questions that good and honorable people are going to disagree about and are going to come to different conclusions about. You know, as atheists have to be willing to make difficult moral choices, and we have to accept the responsibility for those choices and not pawn them off on God. Okay, so that's one key ingredient of an atheist sexual morality, accepting the reality of moral nuance, acknowledging that sexual choices can be difficult without a clear answer, and accepting responsibility for our own sexual choices. Very closely related to that is the idea that we have to not make our sexual decisions by default. There's way too many people who take serious, major steps in their sexual lives without really thinking carefully about whether this is what's best for them, but based on some sort of external social timetable. You know, they don't really think about, is this really the best time for me to do this? Do I even want to do this at all? You know, there's way too many people who decide at what point in a relationship they should stop seeing other people, you know, when they should start having sex, when they should move in together, when they should get married, when they should have kids. Not because it's what's right for them, without ever really talking about or even seriously considering what's right for them. But just because that's what's next, that's what's done. You know, it's like, hey, it's been 3 months, it's time to, you know, it's been, and the details of that timetable vary culturally, but I think we're all kind of familiar with the existence of a timetable. You know, it may vary, it's probably different in South Carolina than it is for me in San Francisco, but, you know, it's like there's so many dates, after so many dates we should be starting to have sex, after so many dates we should be talking about moving in together. You know, after so long of being together, you should be talking about getting married, having kids, and so on. And you know, we have choices about those things. We have choices about, you know, when to move in together, you know, when to start having sex, when to have kids. We have choices about whether to do these things. We have choices about whether to move in together, whether to have kids, whether to get married, whether to even get into a serious relationship at all, or whether maybe being single is what's best for us temporarily or permanently or indefinitely. Making these decisions by default without really careful consideration and discussion of what's right for you and your partner or your partners, it's not fair to yourself, and it is really not fair to your partner. It is a recipe for free-floating sexual resentment. It is a recipe for feeling trapped, 5 years from now or 10 years from now, feeling trapped into a kind of relationship that you're not happy with and resenting your partner for it because you let society make your decisions for you. It's really not responsible, and taking responsibility for our sexual choices is a really key part in an atheist sexual morality. Another important part of an atheist sexual morality is we have to be reality-based. Atheists sometimes really like to pride ourselves on calling ourselves the reality-based community. There's the faith-based community, and then atheists say, well, we're the reality-based community. If we're going to live up to that, we have to apply it to sex. We don't get to just say same-sex marriage will destroy the family. We have to look at the evidence. How do same-sex relationships affect the families, the children of families? How do same-sex relationships affect communities? We don't get to just say porn desensitizes people and teaches them to treat their partners like objects. We have to look at the evidence of how people who enjoy porn, how it affects them. Whether different kinds of porn affect people differently, whether frequent porn consumption affects people different from occasional porn consumption. When we're evaluating the ethics of a particular sexual act or arrangement, we have to practice good evidence-based practices. And that includes being willing to change our minds. I was once in a debate online with an atheist, and I'm going to stress this. This was a debate with an atheist this is on the Daylight Atheist blog in the comments section. And we were debating about polyamory. Polyamory, for those who are familiar with the term, it's a term for a consensual, mutually agreed upon situation in which people have more than one sexual partner or more than one romantic partner. Poly meaning many, amory meaning love. Some people don't like the term, among other things, it mixes Greek and Latin roots, and that gets up people's nose. Other terms you may hear meaning more or less the same thing are non-monogamy, open relationships, or multiple relationships. So anyway, I was in a debate online with an atheist who was insisting that polyamorous relationships were inherently unequal and selfish because of what he referred to as the inequity and selfishness of the standard polyamory setup. I.e., a harem-type relationship where there's one person who has multiple partners, and those partners don't interact sexually with each other or with anybody else outside the relationship. He's saying there's this standard polyamory setup, and it's unequal because one person gets all the nookie and all these other people don't. Okay. So it was pointed out to him in this debate by many people who were polyamorous and non-monogamous, and also people who were just familiar with that world, that there is no such thing as a standard polyamory setup. I mean, really? It's like if you talk to polyamorists, you will find there is a huge variety of arrangements, of ways that people arrange their sex lives and their romantic lives. It is enormously varied. And believe me, they will tell you all about it at great length if you let them. It's like really, there's a handful of kind of core, very broad templates of how people do polyamory and non-monogamy, but really, it's an enormous variety. And people will change their arrangements, based on, over time, based on the needs of the people who are in the relationships. But this person making this argument refused to change his position, even though the evidence was staring him in the face that he was wrong. He very stubbornly continued to defend his position. That is not good atheist or humanist sexual morality. We need to be willing to change our minds when we're confronted with evidence that contradicts it. If we're going to ask that of religious believers, we have to ask it of ourselves. And this story points out another principle. When it comes to sex, we need to be willing to listen to the people who are actually having the kind of sex that we're considering. There's way too many people who are willing to make moral judgments about gays and lesbians, about polyamorous and non-monogamists, about porn consumers, about consensual sadomasochists, transgendered people, asexual people, sex workers, sex work customers, and so on, without ever talking with any of these people. Without ever reading the writings of any of these people, without, for heaven's sake, it's like typing the word into Google and spending 10 minutes, reading what these people say about their own lives. That's not good humanist sexual morality. We can't prioritize our own preconceptions about a particular kind of sex at the cost of actually ignoring the people who engage in it. Okay, now very importantly, we don't necessarily have to agree with these people. You know, I've gotten into conversations with people about whatever kind of sex act or arrangement they were involved in. You know, I've listened to them, I've listened quietly, I've asked them questions, I've gone on the internet and read what other people said about this kind of sexuality. And at the end of the day, I've decided, actually, no, I think what you're doing is pretty screwed up. I don't think it's okay. We don't have to agree, but we have to listen. And we have to consider the possibility that, you know what, the people who are actually having this kind of sex maybe know a little bit more about it than we do. And very closely related to that, we have to remember that media depictions of alternative sexuality is often very inflammatory and very sensationalist. We have to not assume that we know everything there is to know about a certain kind of sexuality just because we read an article about it somewhere. All of which leads to my final principle of an atheist and humanist approach to sexuality. Okay, that's a big lie, it's not my final principle. My final principle for today, I could gas on about this for hours, but my final principle for today. We cannot make moral judgments about sexuality purely on the basis of what grosses us out. This is a surprisingly difficult principle for many people to grasp, including many atheists. This idea that personal revulsion is a good barometer of moral revulsion, it's really very common. It's very common for people to say, I am personally just really upset by the idea of homosexuality. I'm really upset by the idea of non-monogamy. I'm really upset by the idea of sex work. I'm upset by the idea of sadomasochism or whatever. It's like thinking about these things makes me really uncomfortable. Imagining doing them myself makes me really upset. Therefore, they're immoral and nobody else should do them. I look, for instance, at the arguments that most commonly get made against homosexuality. God forbids it, obviously that's at the top of the list. But a close second is anal sex is disgusting. And as moral foundations, these two concepts make about as much sense as each other, which is to say, zero. And it's a really lousy argument to make against homosexuality anyway. Lots of gay people don't have anal sex, and lots of straight people do. I digress. So here's a way that I have found really useful of looking at this question. Looking at this question of personal revulsion and moral revulsion about sex. When I'm pondering some question of sexual ethics, I find it's often really useful to make a non-sexual analogy. You know, our feelings about sex run very strong and they're not always very rational. They're often not rational. And there's lots of cultural reasons for that. You know, we're sort of instilled with a lot of fear and anxiety about sex. There's also probably some biological evolutionary reasons for that. Our feelings about sex run very strong. They're not always rational. And so when we're pondering a question of sexual ethics, I find that it's often very useful to make a non-sexual analogy, to take it out of a sexual context, so it's not the lizard hindbrain doing the thinking. And when it comes to this question of whether personal revulsion should translate into moral revulsion, I like to do what I call the broccoli test. I personally am revolted by broccoli. I mean, really, seriously and profoundly nauseated. Even being in the room when it's being cooked makes me a little bit queasy. Even a small amount of it in any kind of food makes it completely inedible to me. Even standing up here talking about it is making me a little bit sick to my stomach. But I don't think that people who do eat broccoli are immoral. I don't try to talk people out of eating broccoli. In fact, I try to talk them into eating broccoli because it's really good for you. I really kind of wish I liked it. I certainly don't try to get laws passed banning broccoli. You know, I'm not out there at the farmer's market every Saturday with a big picket sign and a picture of broccoli with like a slashed circle through it and a big red lettering saying never again. That's the next thing I should get. It makes me hilarious, but you know, I don't do that. I don't make broad moral generalizations about the kind of people who eat broccoli. I don't try to avoid friendships and relationships with people who eat broccoli. My wife eats broccoli. She's probably at home eating it right now. Saying, "What if I'm not home and she can cook it without making me sick?" And I don't try to get people who do eat broccoli banned from teaching in the public schools because their moral turpitude clearly renders them unfit to be in the presence of children. Okay, so by the same token, there are kinds of sex that I find completely unappealing, even actively unpleasant. An example of this is a fetish called adult diaper play. This is a sexual fetish where some adults like to dress up as babies, and they like to wear diapers, and they like to have certain kinds of sexual activities in doing this. Totally turned off by it. Not interested in even trying it. Who cares? Who cares what I think about it? Nobody's making me do it. And if the people who are doing it, if it's bringing them joy, if it's bringing them meaning, if it's making them feel connected with each other, if it's just bringing them sexual pleasure, what possible business is it of mine? If they're consenting and they're happy, it's entirely none of my business. I don't want to do it, and I completely, 100% support and encourage the people who do. And it's really common for people to do this sort of dime store psychology about other people's sex lives. You know, it's really common for people to say, oh, well, sexual masochists have guilt complexes, and they think they need to be punished, and that's why they're masochists. And, you know, sex workers have poor self-esteem, and that's why they get into sex work. And what was the one they used to say in the 50s about how homosexuals had domineering mothers and absent fathers? It's really not very helpful. The reality is we don't understand sex very well. And we especially don't understand what causes different types of sexuality and different types of sexual desire. The answers are almost never as simple as that old Freudian thing about how, oh, he saw a pair of ladies' shoes at an impressionable age, and that's why he is a shoe fetish. You know, we all saw ladies' shoes at an impressionable age, and, you know, most people aren't shoe fetishists. And really, it's never that simplistic. Trying to figure out what causes particular sexual desires is like reading tea leaves in a hurricane. The answers are very complex. What is it that the social scientists say? It's multifactorial. And the causes aren't necessarily going to be the same for everybody. We don't understand the degree to which they're born or learned or both. And that may be a different answer for different people. There may be some people for whom sexual masochism is like kind of this psychological thing that they learn from, you know, their upbringing and their relationships with other people. And for some people, sexual masochism may be just really biologically hardwired. We don't know, and it could be different for different people. And so, apart from really obviously grossly immoral sexual acts like rape or child molestation, sexual desire is a really lousy barometer of personal character. And we have to remember that we're tempted to make moral judgments about other people based on what kind of sex they like. And whenever I'm tempted to do that anyway, whenever I'm just sort of being really profoundly squicked by somebody else's sexuality, and that kind of moral ickiness is making, that kind of personal ickiness is making me think there's gotta be something wrong with that. I don't know what it is, but there's gotta be something wrong with it because it's gross. I have to remember there are plenty of people who are plenty grossed about by what I do sexually. And I know that what I do sexually is consensual, and it's harmless, and it makes everybody involved really happy. And I guarantee you that that is true for every single person in this room. No matter what you are doing sexually, there is somebody in the world who thinks it's disgusting. There are gay men and lesbians who think that opposite-sex sex is the most revolting thing they've ever heard of. There are people who think that celibacy is unnatural and harmful and unhealthy and nobody should do it. No matter what you are doing sexually, somebody thinks it's bad and harmful and gross. And so if I want other people to respect my right to make my own sexual choices, you know, again, as long as they're consensual and not hurting anybody and so on, I need to extend that same respect to other people. I need to not treat their private sexual practices as a personal affront to me. And this principle of separating aesthetic judgments about sexuality from moral ones, it doesn't just apply to how we treat these larger questions of sexual morality in society. It doesn't just apply to how we treat strangers or even how we treat our friends and family. It applies to the people we're having sex with. If we don't like porn, and our partner does, we don't get to just say, porn upsets me, therefore you're a bad person for enjoying it. You know, if we want our relationship to be monogamous, and our partner doesn't, we don't get to just say, non-monogamy freaks me out, therefore you're a bad person for being interested in it. You know, and similarly, the flip side of that is also true. If we are interested in, you know, porn or non-monogamy or whatever, and our partner isn't, we don't get to accuse them of being unadventurous and uptight. We have to accept that our partner's views and our partner's desires are as valid as ours. Again, assuming that it's grounded in a core moral framework. And we have to work out a compromise that works for both of us, based on the assumption that our desires are equally valid. You know, we have to base those decisions on principles of consent and honesty and fairness and harm, and not on the principle of what we find gross. And there's a way of looking at this question of negotiating sexual desires and sexual likes and dislikes with our partners that I found really useful. Again, it's an analogy, and then again, it has to do with broccoli. Okay, so I don't like broccoli, as I've already said. I also don't like tofu. Now, what I mean when I say I don't like broccoli is really different from what I mean when I say I don't like tofu. When I say I don't like broccoli, I mean I cannot stand it. I can't stand to even be near it. I don't even a small amount of broccoli in food is going to make it completely inedible to me. When I say I don't like tofu, what I mean is, it's really not my favorite thing. It's fine, there's nothing really wrong with it, but, when my partner and I are deciding what to have for dinner, I'm probably not going to say, let's have some of that squishy, slimy stuff. That would be awesome. But if tofu is in a dish that I otherwise like, if it's cooked in a really delicious sauce and it's kind of absorbed the sauce, if it's in a dish with other little tasty tidbits that I like, I can not just accept it, I can enjoy it. Is everybody getting the analogy here? If there's sexual things that you like, that you don't like, that you like and you don't like, it's useful to sort, and you're kind of trying to negotiate that with your partner, it's useful to sort out your likes, your dislikes, in terms of, is this broccoli or is this tofu? And, if it's tofu, and Ingrid really wants tofu that night, we can usually find a way to make it work. We can usually find a way to say, let's get some stuff in there in that dish that I like, and, and besides, I want Ingrid to be happy. One of my pleasures in life is for my partner to have pleasure. And so if there's something that will really give her pleasure, and I'm okay with it, I can get pleasure out of her joy. Okay, so these are some ideas of atheist sexual ethics, some ideas of how we can view sexual morality without believing in a God who's telling us who to boff and how. And these ideas are not coming out of nowhere. I would love to lead you to think that I'm some sort of super sexual genius and I came up with this whole philosophy all by myself on the plate over here. But that's not true. This is very much rooted in decades of work. For decades, there's been a sex-positive community. Writers, educators, activists, researchers, therapists, artists, and just people, ordinary people in their everyday lives, who are advocating for this non-taboo-based approach to sex, to approach the sex that's based on actual core ethics. And this community has been loudly and passionately opposed to the conventional religious view of sex. They've been passionately opposed to God's checklist. This idea that God really cares who we're having sex with and how, and we should base our sexual decision on His rules. And yet, while the sex-positive community has vehemently rejected this conventional religious view of sex, to a great extent it's done this not by rejecting religion altogether, but by embracing alternative religion, and by bringing their religious views and their sexual views together and fusing them. The sex-positive community is very often a very spiritual community, and it's especially New Age spiritual. That's very common. Wicca, goddess worship, shamanism, Tantra, astrology, ki, chakras, the belief in collective metaphysical consciousness, and many other forms of New Age belief really permeate the sex-positive community. It drives me up a tree. And it drives me up a tree because, for a lot of reasons, but especially because these spiritual beliefs are often not separated from the sexual culture. They're often very tightly woven into it. And that brings me to the second part of my talk. We've been talking about how atheists can frame sexual ethics without religion. But how can we frame sexual transcendence without religion? What alternative can we present to the religious view of sexual transcendence? How can we acknowledge and celebrate the very real power of sex to transform consciousness, to take us out of time, to transport us out of ordinary physical experience, to connect us with our partners in a way that is so powerful and so intimate that it can feel almost telepathic? How can we do that and still frame it as an entirely physical, entirely material, non-supernatural experience? how can we view sex without religion? And I don't just mean sex without the capricious, vengeful, petty God who's obsessed with other people's sex lives, but sex without key energy and immortal consciousness of the universe and honoring the goddess with our pleasure and, all of that stuff. I think it's not news to any atheist here that the materialist view of life in general, and sex in particular, it's often viewed as bleak. It's often viewed as cold, narrow, mechanical, reductionist, and just generally speaking, a downer. How can we offer an entirely atheist, entirely materialist philosophy of sex that's warm, rich, meaningful, intimate, and joyful? Well, I'm not going to offer you dogma here. I do think that ultimately this is a question that we each need to answer for ourselves in our own life. But I was asked to speak here on this question, so I'm going to take a stab at it. I'm going to talk about how I view this, and based on my experience, these views resonate with a lot of other people. Okay, so the materialist view says there is no supernatural world at all. There is only the physical world. And all these things that seem non-physical, things like consciousness, thoughts, feelings, choices, selfhood and identity, transcendent sexual ecstasy, all these things that seem non-physical are in fact physical. They are products of our brains. They're products of our brains' interaction with the rest of our bodies, and they're product of our brains and the rest of our bodies' interaction with the rest of the world. We don't yet know exactly how this works. The science of neurology and neuropsychology, these sciences are very much in their infancy. We don't really understand exactly how the brain produces consciousness, but the overwhelming body of hard evidence is that that's true. Whatever consciousness is, whatever in 100 years or 200 years from now we figured out what consciousness is, it's a product of the brain. It's a physical process. And to me, this is not a downer. This is magnificent. To me, this idea that out of nothing but earth and water and sunlight, these wildly complex living beings have come into existence. And we've developed not just the capacity for life, not just the capacity for consciousness, but with the capacity to create joy, with the capacity to create the experience of ecstasy for ourselves and for each other. That is jaw-droppingly astonishing. We can create this experience of joy. We can create deep, expansive pleasure that takes us out of ourselves and into each other, and we do it through a complex rearrangement of the energy of the sun and the atoms and molecules of the planet. That is magnificent. We are how the universe experiences joy. And more than any spiritual belief I ever had, that makes me feel both humble and proud. That gives me chills. And it makes me feel intimately connected with the rest of the universe in a way that no spiritual belief or practice ever did. There's an old hippie song about how we're stardust made of billion-year-old carbon, and you don't have to believe in metaphysical energy to think that that is wicked cool. We are made of stars, and out of stars we create joy. So there's something else too. When we look at human beings from a materialist standpoint, and specifically from an evolutionary standpoint, not as special spiritual entities, not as special creations of God, not as children of the goddess, just as another twig on the evolutionary tree, on a massively branching, millions of years old, billions of years old evolutionary tree, just one little twig. That view puts sex squarely front and center in the human experience. Sex has an enormously important part to play in evolution. Darwin wrote an entire book about sex. Why does sex feel good? Sex feels good because sex evolved to feel good. Sex feels good because evolutionary forces very strongly favor animals who really, really, really like having sex. Now, this is something of an oversimplification. If there's any evolutionary biologists in the audience, oh wait, that's an oversimplification, and it's true. For one thing, evolutionary forces also favor animals who are picky about their sex partners. And also not all reproduction is sexual, but it is a huge part of the picture. Now, of course, It's true that not all reproduction is sexual. It's also true that not all sex is reproductive, and that's true for other animals as well as us. There's lots of evidence about non-reproductive, adaptations of sex in lots of animals other than us. And that's kind of especially true for human beings because human beings have been using birth control and other non-reproductive sexual practices, to put it delicately, to really shift this picture. We are really very consciously putting reproduction into our conscious control. And we're very consciously and deliberately, over the last several decades especially, we're setting apart reproduction from sexual pleasure. And that doesn't even include non-sexual reproductive practices like in vitro fertilization. And I'm totally fine with that. Without getting into too much inappropriate detail, my own sex life, entirely non-reproductive. I am a lesbian identified bisexual who doesn't have kids, and who doesn't want kids, who never wanted kids, who never planned to have kids, and in any case, who had a hysterectomy last year. My ovaries had their shot, and they blew it. My DNA did not get replicated, and it's not happening. And I'm fine with that. I am entirely in favor of sex shifting away from its original evolutionary function. And in fact, I would argue that many of the most beautiful and valuable and meaningful parts of human life and the human experience happen when we take these really deeply rooted evolutionary drives and we transform them into something far beyond their simple, original meanings of survival and reproduction. We took our animal need for palatable food, we turned that into chocolate souffles. We took our very uniquely human ability to make and use tools, we turned that into the Apollo moon landing. We took our uniquely human ability to communicate very, very precisely through language, we turned that into King Lear. And the same is true for sex. We've taken this hardwired, millions of years old urge to replicate our DNA. We have turned it into this intense, delightful form of communication, intimacy, creativity, personal expression, affection, and love, regardless of whether any DNA gets replicated in the process. But it's undeniable that these evolutionary forces are where the roots of sexual pleasure lie, and they are roots that go back hundreds of millions of years. So in other words, according to a materialist standpoint, the capacity for transcendent sexual joy, it is hardwired into our brains deeply and powerfully. It is a crucial and central feature of our lives, and it's wired that way by hundreds of millions of years of evolution. And this has a couple of implications. One of the most obvious implications is that, suppressing and trivializing sex is really stupid. It's futile, it's not going to work, and it's really dangerous and harmful when people try it. But that's not the only thing it means. It means that the act of sex and the experience of sexual pleasure connects us to every living thing on earth. We are the cousins of everything that is alive today. We have a common ancestor going back billions of years, back in the primordial soup. And we are all related, every living thing on this planet related, not entirely, but substantially because of sex. That is awesome. That makes me want to get on a plane, fly home to San Francisco, and have sex with my wife right now. Just so that I can feel the sense of connection with my fish and tetrapod and primate ancestors. That just makes me happier than almost anything. And finally, when you don't believe in God, and when you don't believe in any sort of afterlife, when you believe that this short life is all that we have, then making the most of that short life and taking advantage of the joyful experiences it has to offer, that suddenly becomes a lot more important. And it's almost a moral obligation. As Richard Dawkins very eloquently pointed out, the odds against you personally having been born are beyond astronomical. The odds against that particular sperm and that particular egg happening to meet at that second, and not a different sperm, which would have meant you wouldn't have been born. The odds against that, and then multiply that by the odds against your parents being born, and the odds against their parents being born, and the odds against their parents being born. The odds of you just being here at all beyond astronomical. Are you going to waste that astronomically unlikely life by not giving yourself and not giving other astronomically improbable people as much joy as you possibly can? Okay, now this doesn't mean, as many anti-atheists claim, that without belief in God or an afterlife, we would just behave selfishly and with no moral compass. Doesn't mean that even a little bit. We covered that in part one. What it does mean is that we can base our morality, including our sexual morality, on how our behavior demonstrably affects people in this life, and not on how it supposedly affects these invisible, unproven, hypothetical beings in this hypothetical life after this one, in this hypothetical realm beyond this one. And it means that as long as we don't cause harm to people in this life, it's not only acceptable, it's not just morally neutral, it is a positive and meaningful good to engage in any activities that bring joy and epiphany and meaning to ourselves and to each other, including and maybe especially sex. So in other words, I don't think we need to see sex as spiritual in order to see it as transcendent. I don't think we need to see sex as, blessed by God or blessed by the goddess. We don't need to see it as a telepathic connection between souls, a channeling of the key energy. We don't need to see it as any form of worship or spiritual practice in order to see it as valuable. I think we can see sex as a physical act between animals and still see it as deeply, richly valuable and meaningful. I think we can see sex as a physical act between animals and still see it as an act that connects us intimately, not only with ourselves and with one another, but with all of life and with the expanse of history and with the vastness of the universe. Thank you.
Since we still have a little bit of time left, we'd like to open up the floor for a Q&A. So, if you have any questions.
Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
Do you think teaching children masturbation is wrong, should be spoken out against? There's so many Christian people that they're still teaching it in church, and if it comes up in mixed conversation, do you think as atheists we should be saying, like I know when I read on some blogs, that it is a form of child abuse. It's just such a horrid thing to grow up feeling guilty and not understanding what it is. So do you think it does more harm for our cause to be vocal about something so personal and so intense, or should we be saying things?
So the question is, if we see or hear people either in personal conversation or like online forums or whatever, teaching harmful sexual ideas to children, especially saying things like, masturbation is sinful and so on, should we speak out against that? Certainly, I think that it is harmful, and I think that speaking out against it has tremendous value to the degree that we can do so. Yes, I think that the only way we're going to counter those kinds of ideas is to speak out against this, and to talk about not just to sort of express our own opinion, but to talk about, first of all, the enormous mountain of body of research showing that no, actually masturbation isn't harmful, and it's actually really natural, and it's a healthy way to learn about your own body and to be able to share your body with your partner when you eventually do that. But also, sort of, I think it's worthwhile to talk about the evidence against it, and also just to talk about why we think it's an immoral teaching. Why we think that it's, like I was saying earlier, that to teach children that, when you think about masturbation, it's like, talk about an ethically neutral act. I think it's a positive act because it teaches us to be comfortable with our bodies, and it teaches us what we like sexually, and therefore we will have better sex with our partners. But minimally, it is the most morally neutral act you can engage in, and teaching children that God hates it, and that God will punish them for it, and God's going to burn them for it. Yes, I think that's horribly immoral. And I think that to the degree that we can speak out against it, we should. Now, the question of what you should do in any given situation, that's trickier, and everybody kind of has to make their own decisions. We all make our own decisions about when is it, you know, the cost-benefit analysis, picking our battles, when is it worth having this argument and when is it not? You know, what you do online where you can never get away from it ever again, you know, might be something different from, you know, what you do just in personal conversation and so on. And I can't tell you, you know, what's going to make it harder for you if you're trying to get on the school board. And, you know, you're saying it's okay to teach kids about, you know, you know, we shouldn't be teaching kids that masturbation is going to send them to hell. You know, you kind of have to make your own decisions about that, but I do think that to the degree that we can speak out against this, we should. And especially because that's, and I think that we're afraid to talk about sex, you know, it's like because, especially, I'm sure, especially in the South, where there's a lot of right-wing Christianity and there's a lot of right-wing Christian sexual fear and sexual, you know, anxiety being produced. But actually, sex is one of atheism's biggest selling points. I don't know, did people see the sex and secularism study that was done a couple of years ago? And there's this research that was done a couple of years ago. It was a very wide study of many thousands of atheists asking about sex and asking about what their sex life was before they left religion, if they used to be religious, and afterwards. And what they found was that almost universally, people's sex lives improve when they leave religion. Now, interestingly, people don't change what they're actually doing sexually. There's sort of this idea that, you know, it's liberating sexual free-for-all, you let go of God's rules and you're just going to run around having sex with horses on the street or whatever. And what they found is that that's actually not true. People do almost exactly the same things that they were doing before they left religion. They're masturbating at the same rate, they're using pornography at the same rate, they're having extramarital sex at the same rate, gay sex, etc. It's just that they don't feel guilty about it, or as guilty, I should say. Sexual guilt over entirely ethical, consensual sexual activity reduces when people leave religion. So that's our big selling point. And I think that we should try to not be afraid of it. You know, it's something that, you know, there may be somebody who's going to listen to that and say, oh, look, see, you know, separating sexual, you know, immorality. There's somebody else who's going to say, sex without pointless guilt. That could be interesting. So I can't tell you what to do in any given situation, but I do think that to the degree that we feel that we can, it's worth speaking on that. And you know, it may short-term, you know, cause some blowback, but I do think that in the long run and even in the medium run, it's a big selling point for us. Other questions? Yes?
I heard that polygamy, even though it may be consensual, so gender biased in one, it's polygyny is always, pretty much always exclusively all male and female. And that actually is damaging to society because there's parallels in countries like China and India where infanticide, you know, if you have a girl, then if there's either selective birth or the woman's killed off, it develops an underclass of males. For every man that has two wives and one man that has no wife. And that causes like an underclass, which leads to violence.
It sounds like what you're talking about is Mormon polygamy, is that the Mormon style polygamy. So the question is, when you're talking about like a social structure that's based on polygamy, and specifically Mormon style polygamy, where it is, you know, that is the harem style. You know, one man, and it's always a man, is encouraged and supported in having multiple wives. And there's lots of problems with this. It's horrible for women and it's horrible for men. It's horrible for women in these polygamous cults, and they are cults, because women are pressured and even forced from a very, very young age to marry whoever their preacher tells them to marry, and not who they choose to marry. And that is, you know, that particular arrangement is unequal and selfish because it's a man who's getting lots of nookie and the women who aren't. It's also very harmful to men because young men who are brought up in these societies are usually kicked out. They're driven out because they're providing sexual competition for the old guys who are usually the ones who get to have all the wives. And like you say, it's like, you know, what you have is a few men who get to be married and then a whole lot of men who don't and who are on the outcast. So, you know, the problem with that arrangement, that's very, very different from polyamory. That's very different from polyamory, monogamy, open relationships, where it's pretty much gender neutral, you know, where anybody can do this, have this kind of arrangement. You know, men, women, people who don't identify in the gender binary, Bisexual people can have arrangements with people of different genders, same sex, opposite sex, whatever. That's a very different kind of thing because it's fluid. For one thing, there's not one of the big problems with polygamy is that in the polygamous cults, there's no other option. You're not taught that there's any other option. You're taught that that's it. That's what God wants. God wants men to have multiple wives, and how you're supposed to do that when you don't have 10 times more women than men is never very clearly explained. So when you have that kind of social pressure and religious pressure to have this one particular kind of sexual arrangement, that's where the problems come. People sometimes ask, are you an advocate of, polyamory? And I say, well, I'm not an advocate of polyamory. I'm an advocate of polyamory being a choice. I don't think it's right for everybody, but I do think that it's right for a lot of people. But again, minus social pressure to do it or not to do it, and minus social pressure about how it's supposed to be gendered. Yes.
All the sexual differences that you're talking about, individual differences. I'm just thinking about children and their developmental boundaries. That at some point these sort of differences are going to start manifesting themselves in the children, so that you might have some children who are interested in sexual exploration much younger than others.
Sure.
Some that maybe aren't interested at all, and some that might be so interested that you as a parent would be worried for them. So what I'm curious about is what do you think is a healthy approach for a parent that because there's always a difficulty with children, right? Because they're not fully autonomous yet.
Yeah.
So there's always a kind of ethical conundrum there. How do you orient yourself towards your children to give them what they need as they're developing their autonomy sexually?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The question is about how do we teach our children about sexuality? How do we sort of, on the one hand, allow our children to be who they are sexually, and on the other hand, we're trying to teach them from right and wrong. We're trying to teach them from hurting themselves and protect them from harm and so on. I'm not an expert in that field. I'm not a child developmental expert, and also I don't have children. What I will say is that there is a large body of research on this subject. If you go to the Planned Parenthood website, they have really good guidelines, and I think they got it from, what's the name of the organization? It's SIECUS, it's the Sex Information and Educators, something, SIECUS is the acronym. I forget what it stands for, unfortunately. But if you go to Planned Parenthood, you'll find it. What they have is, here are guidelines on what is age appropriate for you to talk with your children about what's appropriate for them to know and for what's appropriate for them to be doing. It'll say things like, at 4 years old, they should be understanding this. They should be understanding things like, masturbation is fine, but it's something that you do in private. They should be at 8 years old, they should be understanding, this at 8 and this at 10 and this in high school. And this is sort of based on a lot of research and also just sort of research on, development and what can kids at 4 understand and process versus what can kids at 14 or 16 understand and process. So I can't really give you that answer, but what I can tell you is that answer exists. Go to Planned Parenthood, go to SIECUS, and they have, the sort of the core of it is, give your kids as much information as they can handle, and give them a framework of consent and so on. It's like you can teach your kids sexual morals without overwhelming them with more information than they can really cope with, without being inappropriate and invasive. Other questions? Yes?
First of all, I'm sorry that there is broccoli on the...
If it's raw, I can deal with it.
You might not want to go back. I feel like nowadays the whole thing with porn is it's an even bigger taboo than talking about gay marriage. For example, the laws about sexting with young people that are 17 or 16 or whatever the age of consent is, I don't really know what it is in South Carolina. If they sext pictures to each other, they can actually, become felons for life and that sort of thing. And what is, people just don't seem to really talk about that issue. The whole issue of high school kids having sex and it's a crime, even though it's consensual.
Yeah.
I guess I don't really have a question. That's
an idea that I can riff off of easily. So it has to do with, And there's sort of the issue of porn, but it sounds like more you're talking about the issue of teenagers.
Yeah.
Of like, how do we talk about teenage sexuality, and what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, how do we deal with consent issues, especially. And it has to do with, things like, sexting and so on, and also just teenagers' sexual behavior with each other. And I do think that, first of all, as a society, we are so not sane about this. As a society, we are just really twisted up about this. And to some extent, I think that that's religiously based, but some of it is, it's hard. The whole question of age of consent is difficult. The question of at what point are you capable of consenting to sex? It's a complicated one, it's a nuanced one, but it's one where the law has to draw a bright line, and that bright line might not be appropriate. There might be people who are, let's assume the age of consent is 18, there might be people who are 17 who are very mature and capable of making these decisions, and people who are 19 and 20 who aren't. And yet the law has to draw a line. There's a model that I've seen for handling this that I think is really useful. And it's the model of having, instead of a two-step system where it's like, you're too young to consent, you're not old enough to consent, it's a three-step system. And the idea is that under a certain age, like usually say around 12, you really are not old enough to consent to have sex, with anybody of any age. You can't make that decision for yourself. Then there's a middle age where, like between say 12 and 18, where it's seen that it's acceptable, you're capable of consenting to sex with people who are close to your own age. It's understood that teenagers sexually experiment with each other, that's natural, it's normal, it's healthy, but it's also an understanding that people who are a lot older than you can take advantage of you. And so there's, I think there are countries, or maybe even states that do this, that say, okay, if you're between 12 and 18, it's okay to have sex with somebody as long as they're no more than like 2 years older, or 2 years younger than you. Because, really it's like if you're 14, yeah, if you're 15, you could probably consent to have sex with somebody who's 16. You really can't consent to have sex with somebody who's 40. Because they just have a lot, adults have a lot of power over teenagers and over kids. And then the line says that over a certain age, 18, then, all bets are off. And as long as other consent is in place, then you're okay. Again, it's always going to be the situation where it's the law, so you have to draw clear lines where it's not necessarily appropriate for everybody. But I think that that's a better system, and one that acknowledges nuance, and also that acknowledges the reality of, healthy teenage sexuality, but also the reality of adult taking sexual advantage of minors, in a way that kind of acknowledges both of those things. Does that answer?
Yeah, and it's just, I think that as far as for example, the sexting thing, I think the punishment for that is so extreme.
Yes.
There was a case of some couple, I believe they were South Carolina high school kids. The one kid I think was 18.
Yeah.
And they called in a bomb threat to the school because he wanted to be able to hang out with her for the day and not have to go to school.
Yeah.
But what got him in really big trouble was that he had a picture of her naked on his cell phone.
Yeah.
And that was going to be, something like 5 years in jail and be a sex offender for life. But the bomb threat thing was just going to maybe be 6 months.
Yeah, so that's the thing. And it's true. There is just a lot of hysteria and a lot of just really twisted uppedness about this issue of minors having sex. And again, understandably, there's real issues there. There's real issues having to do with consent there. But it's true, there's also sort of a whole other issue having to do with the sort of the sex crime registry, the whole thing of being registered as a sex criminal, and those laws are just seriously messed up. I mean, because people can and do get on these sex registries. You know about this is basically if you commit a sex crime, you're on this registry, and for your own life, you have to tell your boss, you have to tell your neighbors, and this is, I think, understandable for somebody who's like a rapist, somebody who's a child molester. My understanding is that the evidence shows that it doesn't actually do any good, but it's understandable. The desire that people should know when there's a a rapist in your neighborhood or a child molester in your neighborhood, it's understandable, even though there's not a lot of good evidence. It actually helps reduce these crimes. But a lot of people are on these registries for consensual crimes. People are on it for, like you say, it's like they were sexting and they were 18 and their girlfriend was 17, or they were 18 and their boyfriend was 17. They're on the registry for sex work. which, whenever you think of sex work, it's consensual, usually. If it's not consensual, then that's a problem, but if it is consensual, it's consensual. People are on it for like skinny, you go skinny dipping, you get drunk and you go skinny dipping, and in college and you get arrested. You could be on these registries. So I think that people do have this kind of hysteria about, and it's kind of this thing where nobody wants to be the politician who stands up and says, actually, I'm against the sex criminal registry. Nobody wants to do that, because it makes you seem like a big perv. And especially in places that are law and order places, nobody wants to be the person saying, oh, actually, I think we need to scale back, our penalties here, because they're not working and they're criminalizing people who didn't actually do anything particularly terrible, and it's ruining them for the rest of their life. So I don't know what to do about that. I wish I did. Other than just being willing to be courageous and speak up and say, actually, I think these laws are messed up. They're harmful. There's no evidence that they actually effectively reduce crime. Being the one who's willing to say that, being the one who's willing to say the emperor has no clothes, can have an effect. Other questions?
I think we only have time for like one more.
Okay, so we only have the room for a limited time, so, yes.
Thank you for the talk, I really appreciated it. I was thinking about, is it possible to not be an atheist, but to adopt a secular sexual morality?
Sure. So the question is it possible to not be an atheist but adopt a secular sexual morality? Yes, absolutely. Like I was talking about earlier, I think a lot of people do that. They say, well, God instilled this moral compass in me, God made me want to care about other people. But then, from then on out, they're like, okay, so now I care about other people, I care about harm, I care about justice, I care about fairness, I care about the world, the world being more or less orderly. And that's what I'm gonna, it's like, so I think that there are still some differences, but if your core of your morality is what actually works in the real world, what does the evidence show about what is good for people, and if you're willing to always make that your priority and not your religious beliefs, if you're willing to always make your priority be what's good for people, then absolutely. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming out. Thank you for the great questions, and yeah.